All right, welcome. Have a seat. Take a look at this.
Hey Fairfax, we are so excited to kick off this Christmas season with you, starting with decorating our church building. Decorate Fairfax is a VOMO project this year for you and your family to serve throughout the first week of December. It's going to be a great time. We have projects spread out throughout the week, and it is pre-registration, so make sure that you grab a spot on the VOMO app before it fills up. We are also ready to save the date for all of our December events. You're going to hear more about carols on December 2nd, Advent Prayer December 9th, and all of our Christmas Eve services. We are so excited for this special Christmas season, and we can't wait to see you in person and online. We'll see you soon, Fairfax.
All right, Christmas is going to be awesome around this place this year. It's going to be different. It's going to be like nothing we have ever experienced before as we respond to the realities of what is going on, but it's going to be amazing. There is nothing that can stop us from celebrating the incarnation of God in this world. The coming of God, a God who loves us so much, he would rather enter into our brokenness than stay separated from us. And we are going to celebrate it like crazy this year. And I just want to say, as I say every week, thank you so much for your faithfulness to this place and the giving of your tithes and your offerings. And those of you that are online, have been online maybe the whole time and have continued to be so faithful with that. It's so amazing, and we're so thankful for that. And if you want to give as an act of worship today, if you're online, there's a little button that says give, and you can just click that. And if you're here in the sanctuary, there are offering boxes in the back of the sanctuary. I saw people coming in, getting off envelopes, putting them in the boxes. It's so great. You can put your offerings in there, or you can text Fairfax Give to 77977 if you want to give as an act of worship today. All right, so we're in the 5th week of our series that's called Messiah. And if you've been tracking with us along the way, you know that it's a study in the Gospel of Mark. And Mark was written by a guy named John Mark, who was one of the disciples of Jesus. And it was written to basically proclaim that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is the King. He's the one that Israel has been waiting for all of these centuries, this Messiah who is going to come and set everything right. He's going to take everything that has been broken by sin and make it whole again. And the first week we talked about the arrival of this Messiah. The second week we talked about the politics of this Messiah. The third week we talked about the storm calming power of this Messiah. And last week we talked about the cost of following this Messiah. We talked about how Jesus is a king that did not go to Jerusalem and ascend to a throne like everyone thought that he was going to. He was a king that went to Jerusalem and ascended to a cross, and that if you want to follow Jesus, that you have to be willing, Jesus says, to take up your cross as well, to follow him. And we talked about how taking up your cross means dying to self-determination. It means dying to the need to be in control. It means praying the prayer that Jesus taught us to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane when he prayed the prayer, Father, not my will, but your will be done. Not my agenda in this moment, but your agenda be done. Not my timing, even though I think my timing is perfect. Not my timing, but your timing be done. Now this week we're talking about the leadership style of the Messiah. And before those of you who do not think of yourself as leaders check out, before you those are online and go, I'm not a leader, so this is not for me, or those of you here in the blue seats, you go, I don't see myself in a leadership role. Let me just say that everyone at some level, whether formal or informal, is a leader. You may have formal leadership responsibilities. You may be the head of a department, the head of a company, the head of a classroom, the head of a family, whatever it is. You may have formal responsibilities, or you may have informal leadership responsibilities. Anyone who influences someone else, and all of us influence other people, is a leader. Like if you have influence in the life of someone else, you are a leader. So what Jesus has to say and the leadership style of Jesus impacts all of us. So here's the context. As Jesus and the disciples are on their way to Jerusalem, on their way to the cross, on their way to accomplishing the mission that Jesus came to this earth to accomplish, Jesus tells his disciples exactly what's going to happen when they get to Jerusalem. And he doesn't make them read between the lines. He's not coy in the way that he describes it. You don't have to kind of work to figure it out. He is very explicit in terms of what's going to happen. Look at chapter 10, starting in verse 32. They were on their way to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. Very specific. We're going up to Jerusalem, he said, and the Son of Man will be betrayed by the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death, will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him, spit on him, flog him, and kill him. And 3 days later, he will rise from the grave. So no reading between the lines, no having to figure out what is going to happen when they get to Jerusalem. That's why it's so surprising when you get to the end of the gospel and Jesus actually dies on the cross and the disciples are so disillusioned and disappointed. And it's like they didn't see it coming. And you go, wait a second, Jesus has not been vague about what was going to happen. He has been very specific about the fact that he was going to die, that he was going to be placed in the grave, that he was going to rise again on the third day. Now, there's lots of ways that the disciples could have responded to Jesus in this moment, right? They could have protested like Peter did, and we talked about that last week where Peter said, no, a king doesn't ascend to a cross, a king ascends to a throne. No, a king doesn't suffer. A king rules. And they could have protested. They said, no, we don't think that that's what should happen. They could have responded in that way. They could have responded by celebrating the resurrection that Jesus says about. Jesus has just told them that something is about to happen that's never happened in the history of the world before. So they could have responded by Jesus saying, I'm going to rise again on the third day, by saying, wow, tell us more about that. That's like pretty incredible. So they could have celebrated that. They could have responded by saying, after you rise from the grave, what is this mission going to look like that we're on? Like, it's going to be amazing, right? After you rise from the grave, like what's going to, but they don't respond in any of those ways. None of that happens. Instead, in that moment, two of the disciples, James and John, step forward, and this is what they say. Get this. Then James and John, sons of Zebedee, sons of thunder, they were called, these two brothers, came to him and said, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. That sounds like some of our prayers sometimes, right? Like, we just want you to do whatever we tell you to do, we want you to do it. Sometimes I fall into those kinds of prayers. That's the prayer of John and James here. It's just like, we just want you to do whatever we ask of you. And so Jesus goes along and he says, well, what do you want me to do? And they replied, let one of us sit on your right hand and the other on your left in glory. And Jesus replied, you don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with? Now, in the Old Testament, the word cup and the word baptism referred to some kind of challenging ordeal. It meant that if someone was being baptized, people was drinking a cup, it usually had to do with some challenging ordeal. We still use the word baptism that way when we say someone is going through a baptism of fire. What we're talking about, I say, oh, they're going through a baptism of fire, or I'm in the midst of a baptism of fire. We're talking about a challenging ordeal that we're going through. So that's what baptism meant. But the word cup actually is used to describe an even more specific ordeal. It refers to God's divine justice. For instance, in Isaiah 51, we read this, awake, awake, rise up, O Jerusalem, you who have drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath, the goblet that makes men stagger, the cup of God's wrath. Now, sometimes we get a little hesitant maybe to talk about God's wrath, a little hesitant to talk about God's judgment, a little hesitant to talk about God's justice. Maybe because there is this sense that it does not reflect his love, that when you talk about God's love, and here's this God who loves us so much, he loves us unconditionally, never gives up on us, he's relentless in his pursuit of us. How can you talk about a God who loves us in that way and also talk about God's wrath? In fact, some people read the Bible in the sense that the Old Testament is all about God's wrath and the New Testament is all about God's love, and never the twain shall meet. Like the idea that God's love and God's justice are somehow incompatible. That the more you talk about God's justice, the less you focus on God's love. And the more that God's wrath comes to bear, the less that his love comes to bear. But they're actually not incompatible. In fact, they are inseparable. You cannot have one without the other. You cannot have God's love without God's wrath. You cannot have God's love without God's justice. Think about it this way. If you're an artist, we have a lot of artists in our church. If you're an artist and you see someone destroying or defacing something that you have created, something beautiful that you've created, how does your love for this beautiful thing that you've created in that moment express itself? It expresses itself in anger. There's this sense that what is happening should not be happening. There's this sense as this beautiful work of art is being defaced or this beautiful work of art is being destroyed, that somehow this is not right. This should not be. And what happens is that you just can't sit there passively and watch something so beautiful be destroyed. Love demands that something be done. When something beautiful is being destroyed, love demands that action take place. Love demands that something be done. Or think about it this way. Some of you are parents. If you're a parent and you see someone or something destroying your child, like how does your love for your child in that moment in which something or someone is destroying them, how does your love express itself? It expresses itself in anger. There is a sense that what is happening is not right, that what is happening should not be. You can't just passively sit there and watch your child be destroyed. That love demands that something be done. And it may depend on how old your child is and what that is done, but love demands that something be done. At its essence, what is sin? At its essence, sin is destroying the beautiful thing that God has created. When we fail to love our neighbors as ourselves, when we fail to live out the love that Christ calls us to, we are not only destroying our neighbor, we are destroying ourselves. When we take our bodies and our souls that God has created, that God owns, that belong to God, and we decide that we're the ones who are ultimately in charge, the outcome is destructive for ourselves and the outcome is destructive for others. It's kind of like an 8-year-old who takes the family car out for a spin. I mean, they're going to get hurt and someone else is going to get hurt as well. So God's wrath, God's judgment, God's justice, and God's love are not incompatible. They are, in fact, inseparable. The cup of God's wrath is actually an eternal monument to the love of God. The cup of God's wrath, the cup of his justice, the cup of his judgment is actually an eternal monument to God's love. Now, you go, well, what does this have to do with leadership? I thought this was going to be a message on leadership. Well, everything, because when Jesus died on the cross, he drank of the cup of God's wrath, God's justice. He drank the cup that we should have drank because we're the ones who are destroying the beautiful thing that God has created. It's not Jesus who is destroying the beautiful thing that God has created. It's us. But on the cross, Jesus gave himself for us. On the cross, Jesus served us. On the cross, Jesus drank the cup that we should have drank. And when Jesus asked James and John if they can drink the same cup that he drank, if they can experience the same baptism that he is facing, what he's asking them is a leadership question. He's saying, you want to sit in these positions of power. You want to sit on my right hand and left hand. You want to be in a position of authority. You want to take a role of leadership, like you want to assume the mantle of leadership, but you don't realize what kind of leader I am. I am not a leader that's like the leaders in this world. I serve those who I lead. I give my life for those who I lead. I give myself away for those who I lead. Now, here's what's interesting. When Jesus asked James and John that question, can you take this cup that I'm drinking and can you drink it as well? Their immediate response is yes. They go, yes, absolutely, no problem. We can definitely go through a little hardship. We are definitely willing to deal with a few challenges in order to get the prestigious positions, the prestigious titles that we desire, to sit at your right hand and your left hand. I mean, if we're going to get those prestigious titles, if we're going to get those prestigious positions, Sure, we're willing to go through a little hardship. We're willing to go through a little challenge. We're willing to kind of face some difficulties, all of that. Then look at how Jesus responds to them. They said, we can, they answered, and Jesus said to them, well, you will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with. But to sit at my right hand or my left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared. In other words, Jesus is telling them that they're definitely going to drink from the same cup he's drinking from, in that in following Jesus, they are going to experience challenges and hardship and difficulties and all of that. But he's also telling them that leadership is not just about serving and experiencing difficulties and challenges in order to get what you want. That leadership is not just about serving others so that you can reach your vocational goals. That leadership is not just about serving others so that you can hit your monthly sales goal or get promoted or get a more impressive title. That it's serving others just in order to serve others. It's serving others just because that's what true leadership looks like in the kingdom. Now, when the rest of the disciples see what James and John are doing, they are ticked off at them. I think they're ticked off because they didn't think of it first, actually. But whatever the reason is that they're ticked off. And Jesus brings all the disciples together and addresses the issue of leadership with them. And this is what he says. When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. And Jesus called them together and said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, it's hard to state how mind-blowing this concept is to the disciples. We've talked about it a little bit in this series. This idea of a king who serves. That's not what kings do. Kings do not serve. Kings are served. And they're still served in our culture. Like, serving is not what kings do, but Jesus is saying that's what this king does. This king did not come to be served. This king came to serve. And that doesn't mean that we don't serve Jesus in following him. It just means that our service to Jesus is in response to his service to us. Now, there are all kinds of implications to this. When you're in a vibrant relationship with a leader who is a servant leader, when you're in a vibrant relationship with a leader who serves you, it changes you. And since Jesus is a servant leader, when you're in a vibrant relationship with Jesus, it changes the way you lead. Whatever your leadership responsibilities are, whatever it is that you have been entrusted with, it just changes the way that you lead. When you're in a relationship with a servant leader, you become a servant leader as well. So let me just kind of wrap this thing up by talking about 4 characteristics of a servant leader. The first is this: a servant leader is not preoccupied with recognition. When your primary goal is to serve those that you lead, then being recognized, getting credit, constantly selling yourself, constantly reminding everyone of your resume, of what you've accomplished, of what you've done, of who you know, the connections that you have, the books that you've read, the things that you've done, is not nearly as important. That when you're a servant leader, you just don't have to obsess over whether someone else got more credit on a project, even though you worked harder and contributed more to that project. When you're a servant leader, you just don't have to obsess over letting everyone know that you came up with the idea first. This awesome idea that someone else is getting the credit for. When you're a servant leader, you just don't have to obsess over letting everyone know that you were the one that came up with that idea. When you're a servant leader, you don't have to obsess about making sure that your voice is heard, that your opinion is taken into consideration in every conversation. Now, that doesn't mean And this is where sometimes we misinterpret what it means to be a servant leader. It doesn't mean that servant leaders are passive, and it doesn't mean that servant leaders do not have a boldness in the way that they lead. Jesus was not passive, and Jesus was incredibly bold. It just means that for a servant leader, their boldness is focused on accomplishing the mission, not on promoting themselves. Here's the interesting thing when you read through the Gospels. You definitely see it in Mark, but you also see it. Mark's a little bit shorter, and so in Mark, it's just like the whole book, the whole gospel just seems like is constantly like as Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, on his way to Jerusalem, on his way to Jerusalem. But you see it in all of the Gospels, that no matter what Jesus is doing, no matter what conversations he's having, no matter what teaching is going on, no matter who he's healing, no matter what is going on, Jesus is always focused on the mission. He was always focused on Jerusalem. He was always focused on the cross. He was always focused on why he had come to earth in the first place. In fact, sometimes, and you see this in Mark, sometimes, and it's confusing, sometimes Jesus would heal someone and then tell them, don't tell anyone that I healed you. And you read that and you go, I don't quite understand, because sometimes people then go and tell, sometimes he says don't tell, and then they do, and some people have kind of said, well, he says don't tell, it's reverse psychology, so that they will go and tell. But I don't think it's that. I think it's a kingdom thing for Jesus. Even though in that moment when he healed someone, even though if they went and told, he would get more recognition, his focus wasn't on recognition for himself. His focus was on the mission. And so in that particular situation, it did not advance the mission. We don't know what was going on in Jesus' mind, but it did not obviously advance the mission for them to go and tell what Jesus had done. And Jesus was all about advancing the mission, not about advancing himself. And servant leaders are all about advancing the mission and not about advancing themselves. A servant leader is not preoccupied with recognition. Second thing is a servant leader is not enslaved by the need for affirmation from others. We live in, I think it's fair to say this, that we live in a culture that is enslaved by the need for affirmation. I know that's not true of anyone here, but I mean, the folks out there, like our culture, is enslaved with the need for affirmation. We crave affirmation. We are addicted to affirmation. And all the social media platforms know that. They know that every like, every follow, every view feeds our affirmation addiction. They know that as a culture, we measure our worth one like at a time. We measure our worth one view at a time. We measure our worth one follow at a time, that we're just addicted as a culture to affirmation. Now, that doesn't mean that a servant leader doesn't want the affirmation of others. All of us want the affirmation of others. We love the affirmation of others. It feels awesome. It feels incredible. It's motivating to us when someone says something positive about what we've done or what we've said or how we've performed. There's something motivating about that. It pumps us up. It encourages us. Like all of us want affirmation. A servant leader wants affirmation. It's just that as much as we want affirmation, a servant leader is not enslaved by affirmation. A servant leader is not controlled by what other people think of them. And the reason that that's so important is because oftentimes doing the right thing as a leader will not result in a ton of affirmation. Sometimes doing the right thing as a leader just simply doesn't get much affirmation. In fact, it may result in just the opposite. It may result in attack. It may result in criticism. It may even result in people turning their back on you, people leaving your department, leaving your community, leaving your tribe, leaving your church, leaving your ministry, whatever it is. And if you're a slave to affirmation, then you will find yourself as a leader always tending to do the safe thing. If you're a slave to affirmation, you will always find yourself as a leader always tending to do the popular thing. If you are a slave to affirmation, you will tend to find yourself as a leader always doing the easy thing. And sometimes as a leader, the safe thing or the popular thing or the easy thing is not the right thing to do. I was thinking this week about Moses. And you know how when Moses led the people of Israel out of Egyptian bondage, they went to Mount Sinai and they got the 10 Commandments and all of that, God was telling them at that moment to enter into the promised land. And they were on the southern side of the promised land. And it was like right there, right across. They could just go into the promised land. And God was saying, take the land, take the land, take the land. But in that moment, Moses was a slave to affirmation. Because in that moment, instead of taking the promised land, he sends 12 spies into the land to see what they think. They come back. 10 of the 12, the majority opinion, is do not go into the land. There are giants in the land. We'll get massacred in the land. It will not be a good thing if we go into the land. 2 of the spies, Caleb and Joshua, say, yes, take the land, take the land. And apparently, those reports were then widely spread among all of the people of Israel, because all of the people of Israel were told, knew what the report was from the majority report, the 10 spies, and the minority report, the 2 spies. And all of the people began to say, we should not go into the land, we should not go into the land, we should not go into the land. And in that moment, Moses is a slave to the affirmation of the people and chooses not to go into the land. And you know what the result of that is? 39 more years of wandering in the wilderness. That the people of Israel wandered in the wilderness for another 39 years, primarily because in that moment, Moses was a slave to affirmation. Sometimes, folks, the minority report is right. Sometimes the right thing to do won't always generate the most affirmation. But if we are confident in God's affirmation of us, if we're not enslaved by the affirmation of others, it will set you free to live the bold lives that God has created you to live and to lead in bold ways. You cannot lead boldly if you are a slave to affirmation. That's the second thing. The second thing. The third thing is this: a servant leader prioritizes relationships. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was an amazing pastor, author, part of the confessing church in Hitler's Germany that stood up to Hitler and in fact was part of the plot to assassinate Hitler. He writes something interesting about kind of this whole dynamic. He talked about how the natural impulse of the human heart when you meet someone is to immediately look for a position of what he calls strategic superiority. In other words, the first thing you do when you meet someone is you compare yourself in some way to the person that you're meeting to see if they are a threat to you in any way. You know, if it's at work, could this person take my job? Could this person impact my position at the table? I have a certain position at the table. Could this person maybe impact my position at the table? Will this person be liked more than me? Or is this person better at the same things that I do? Is this person better than me? All of that's the first thing. And then if you don't perceive the person as a threat, you begin to assess how you can use their gifts and talents and abilities to advance you and your cause. It's a very utilitarian approach to leadership. And Washington, D.C. is filled with utilitarian approaches to leadership. When I've talked about this before, when I first moved here, just as a young pastor, I met with some young leaders who worked down on Capitol Hill and who all came from different parts of the country and were here in Washington, D.C. for the first time and had been here maybe a year or 2 years. And I said, what's most surprising about being in this place in Washington, D.C.? And this is what they said, is that it's the utilitarian nature of relationships. That every relationship is utilitarian. Every relationship about what can you do for me, and if you can do something for me, I want to be in a relationship with you. If you can't do anything for me, I don't want to be in a relationship with you. If you can do something for me, I want to be in a relationship with you now. If that ceases, then I really don't care about continuing this relationship. Just this incredibly utilitarian view of relationships, this incredible utilitarian view of leadership. Now, that doesn't mean, and basically what it means is that someone who has a utilitarian view of leadership is defined basically by the question, how can this person serve me? How can this person help me? rather than the question, how can I serve this person? Utilitarian leadership hardly ever asks the question, how can I serve the person who I'm leading? It's always asking the question, how can this person serve my agenda and my needs and my cause? Now, that doesn't mean that servant leaders don't build teams filled with incredibly gifted and talented individuals, passionate individuals to accomplish a common mission. That's the very definition of the church, right? The Apostle Paul describes the church as a body with many parts, and that all the different parts of the body have different gifts, different skills, different passions, different abilities, and that when the body comes together, when it's working together, and all of those different gifts and passions and skills are being used, that incredible things can happen. The difference between a servant leader and those who Jesus calls the rulers of this world is that with a servant leader, relationships actually matter. Like with a servant leader, people feel loved and affirmed, not just used and taken advantage of. With a servant leader, you are more than just the sum total of what you can produce. With someone who has a utilitarian view of leadership, you are primarily simply the sum total of what you can produce. But with a servant leader, you are so much more. Now, some of you are immediately, I know what you're doing, you've been doing this as soon as we started this message, is that you are thinking about someone in leadership over you, and you are thinking, man, they need to hear this sermon. I'm gonna make sure they hear this sermon. No, they do not need to hear this sermon. You need to hear this sermon. God will work in their life in the way that God will work in their life. All of us are leaders, and so whether you're thinking about someone else who is over you, stop thinking about someone else over you and think about the people that you influence, the people that you serve, and what is the difference between servant leadership and utilitarian leadership. Now, that doesn't mean that servant leaders are not concerned with performance. That doesn't mean that servant leaders are not concerned with quality, with the craftsmanship of what the job is that's being done. That does not mean that servant leaders are not committed to excellence and doing everything that they do with excellence and with passion. Think about this. Jesus entrusted the whole mission of redeeming and restoring this broken world, the whole mission of making disciples of all nations. He entrusted that to just a handful of disciples. And the whole world would be impacted by their performance. The whole world would be impacted by the quality of their work. The whole world would be impacted by their commitment to excellence. The whole world would be impacted by whether they just saw what they were doing as a job and just kind of punched the clock and just did what they did and just kind of got by, or whether they were passionate to the core about what they were doing. The whole world would be impacted by that. So it's not that servant leaders are not concerned about excellence or about quality of work or about performance. It simply means that they place a priority on relationships. Think about this. These people that Jesus sent out to do this amazing ministry and task, these are the same people that Jesus spent 3 years with investing in relationally. Over and over again, he demonstrated his love for them in tangible ways, and ultimately, he lays his life down he puts his life on the line for these guys. Jesus didn't use them, Jesus served them. Jesus loved them. Jesus genuinely cared about them as people. And in serving them, this is what's so amazing, in serving them, in loving them, he empowered them to use their gifts and talents and passions and abilities in a way to change the world. Here's the principle in this. Authentic, caring relationships aren't a limitation to missional success. They are essential for missional success. Sometimes when we get into this conversation about the importance of relationships and the importance of missional success, we tend to view them as somehow being on a spectrum, on the opposite ends of the spectrum. And so the more committed you are to the priority of relationships, in some ways, the more you sacrifice missional success. And the more committed you are to missional success, the less focused you can be on relationships. And so oftentimes, leaders feel like, well, I'm going to try to strike a balance here because I do care about the mission and I do care about relationships. And so I'll kind of compromise the mission a little bit and I'll compromise maybe relationships a little bit so that I can somehow do both. No, leadership, the missional success of an organization, of a movement, and the priority of relationships are not on opposite ends of the spectrum. One leads to the other. That relational priority leads over time to missional success. That may not be true in the short term. Like in the short term, you may be able to ignore relational priorities and get something done, but in the long term, ignoring relational priorities will undermine missional success. We see it over and over and over again. And the last thing is this. A servant leader is not paralyzed by fear. By talking about the cup that he must drink and the cup that the disciples must drink, Jesus is reminding the disciples that leadership is not easy, that there are sacrifices in leading, that there's going to be challenges in leading, that's just the nature of leadership, that you should never kind of assume in taking the mantle of leadership that it's going to come without challenges. That's just the nature of leadership, is that it's fraught with challenges. And Jesus is reminding them that no matter who you are, no matter what your leadership role is, that there will be a cup that you have to drink. There will be challenges. There will be difficulties that you will face. But what Jesus is saying is that you do not have to be intimidated by that. That doesn't have to paralyze you with fear, no matter how much experience you have as a leader. Whether you are an experienced leader, whether you are someone who has trained for whatever it is that you're doing for a long time, whether you're a new leader, an inexperienced leader doing this for the first time, is that what it means is that you do not have to be paralyzed by fear because of the challenges that you will face in leadership. That it changes the way you view leadership challenges. It keeps you from being paralyzed by fear. Jesus is saying that I drank of the cup, I served you so that you can drink of the cup, you can serve others and not be destroyed by the cup, not be destroyed by the baptism. And that changes the way you view your own leadership challenges. It keeps you from being paralyzed by fear. And it changes your prayer life. Before I was a pastor here at Fairfax, it's the only church I've ever pastored, been here for 1,000,000 years. Moses and I started it. But before I was a pastor here, I was a youth pastor in Indiana, Anderson, Indiana, home of Pizza King, the best pizza in the world. I was a youth pastor at South Meridian, and I was a young, early in my ministry, young guy, and the senior pastor there was a guy named Emmett Whalen who was ancient. Ancient. And I say that, and when I went there, he was like 3 years younger than me right now. So anyway, he was ancient. But it was really cool. My dad was a pastor, my brother was a pastor, and so I've always had the opportunity to be mentored by and have older pastors that have poured into me, and it's been really great. And Emmett was one of those guys. And I remember asking, Emmett one time, just about preaching especially, because preaching really, really intimidated me, and hadn't preached much, and asking him about, I asked him, I said, do you get nervous still, when you preach? This is the same question I asked my dad, same question I asked my brother Gil, and I asked him, I said, do you get nervous? And he goes, oh yeah, I still get nervous, when I preach. But he said, something changed for me a number of years ago. He said, my prayer when I'd get up to preach, my prayer for a long time was the prayer, Lord, help me, just help me. And I said, I can identify with that. That's my prayer too when I get up, just Lord, help me. But he said, I came to realize that it's a really selfish prayer because Lord, help me is a prayer that's all about me. It's all about, Lord, help me to not embarrass myself. Help me to have something to say. Help me to, do my craft in such a way that when people hear it, they go, oh, he's a really good communicator. It was just all about It was just all about me. And so my prayer changed. I said, what did it change to? And he said, just one word. It changed from Lord, help me to Lord, use me. He said, that changed everything for me. Not just in my preaching, but in all of my ministry, he said. Because the prayer, Lord, use me, is a prayer that's not about me. It's a prayer about the people that I lead. It's a prayer about the people that I serve. It's the prayer about others. It's the prayer about the kingdom. It's a prayer about the world. And once I could kind of get myself out of the way, and that's usually the problem almost always, is we get in the way of what God wants to do. Once I could get out of the way and stop praying, Lord, help me, and start praying, Lord, use me, things began to change in my preaching and my ministry and all of that. And as a young leader hearing that had huge impact on me. And all those many years ago, it changed my prayer. And my prayer, not just in preaching, but just in everything, is, Lord, not help me, but use me. I prayed that prayer this morning when I got up, again, as I thought about today and this moment right now. Just, Lord, use me. Take whatever it is that you have to say and use it in some way that will advance the kingdom and help people and make a difference in their lives. And maybe for some of you, your prayer needs to change in some area of your life. Maybe there's some leadership issue that you're facing where your prayer needs to change from, Lord, help me, to, Lord, use me, use this. Maybe some challenge that you are facing where your prayer needs to change from, Lord, help me, to, Lord, use me, and use this challenge to somehow advance the kingdom. Maybe you're dealing with something physically or something financially or something relationally that's going on where your prayer needs to change from, Lord, help me with this, to, Lord, use me and use this. Use what I'm going through physically. Use what is happening relationally. Use the struggles I'm dealing with financially. Just use this in some way. If there's anything I think that we have hopefully learned in the last 7-8 months as we've navigated through this pandemic, is God's ability to use anything to advance his kingdom. If God can take the worst thing that's ever happened in the history of the world, the nailing of the Son of God to a cross, and use it to accomplish the best thing that's ever happened in the history of the world, our redemption and restoration and forgiveness, God can use anything. So maybe our prayer needs to change from God, help me, to God, use me. Now that's our prayer. We want you to use us. We want you to use us as leaders. All of us have been entrusted with some mantle of leadership, people that we influence, people that look to us in some way. Maybe it's formal, maybe it's informal. But Lord, we pray that would be our prayer. Lord, use me to lead well. Use me to serve well. Use this situation, this challenge, this difficulty, this thing that I'm going through. Just use it. Use it in a way that will advance your kingdom. Bring heaven to earth. Remind us that heaven really is all around. Lord, we just surrender all of that to you. In the name of Christ, our King, our servant King. In the name of Christ we pray.